Hey, everybody. Good evening and welcome once again to this month's edition of the Watch Club with the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival. I am Program Director James Sullivan. We're going to be talking tonight about a film that's especially near and dear to my heart for reasons we'll get into in a minute. We have director Michael Bonfiglio, who's the co-director of George Carlin's American Dream, fantastic new two-part doc on HBO about, obviously, George Carlin. Michael co-directed the film with a guy who you may have heard of named Judd Apatow. See the crawl on the bottom there. Don't forget to click on our YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button if you're interested in this or any of our other interviews. We do one every month in the Watch Club, and we're doing some good stuff. We really are enjoying these conversations. So if you're interested, click to subscribe, and you'll get notified. I'm going to bring on Michael in one moment, but for the benefit of those of you who maybe haven't had a chance yet to watch the George Carlin doc, let's go ahead and take a look at the trailer.
Would you all meet George Carlin?
Hey, baby, what's happening?
We got assholes, scumbags, jerk-offs, and dipshits. And they all vote.
He was funny, he was smart, he was opinionated.
I wanted to be just like him.
He was just so cool.
Here's the list of words you can't say all the time.
Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tit.
And the crowd goes crazy.
Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits.
They arrested me for profanity.
The Supreme Court restricts the broadcast of dirty words.
I'm going to jump to it right now. He's the Beatles of comedy.
I began this dream of standing in front of people and having their attention.
My mother was his biggest champion. She just had a way of lifting people up and believing in them. They were comrades in arms. But then what happened was superstardom. My mom was alone all the time. She's feeling left behind, and now the drugs are there. And that really did undermine everything in our family.
I did as much cocaine as there was in the immediate three-county area at that time.
He had collapsed in on himself.
My career began to wane. I had to find my voice.
In 1988, we were going to go do the show to laugh at him because he was this older comic, and Carlin came out with like a howitzer.
Now they're thinking about banning toy guns, and they're gonna keep the fucking real one!
You didn't want to be that George Carlin anymore. You want to be a different George Carlin.
What I really was a rebel.
Can't educate our young people, can't get health care to our old people, but we can bomb the shit out of your country, all right?
Come on, rise and win.
Stand-up's the hardest thing. He did the hardest thing for the longest time.
He was challenging society to be better.
Life is sacred? Who said so? God? Hey, if you read history, you realize that God is one of the leading causes of death.
George is still relevant. He changed comedy 3 or 4 times, and he's still talking to us.
Things that he was getting at were so profound to the culture.
What would you do if you were the planet trying to defend against this pesky species? Viruses. They try to divide people so that they can run off with all the fucking money.
Bullshit is the glue that binds us as a nation. It's the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it.
Come on, rise and win.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Bonfiglio to the Watch Club. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Hey, good to see you, James. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to have you. Mike and I met because he asked me to be, this is why this is near and dear to my heart, obviously. Among other things, I'm the author of a book about George Carlin named 7 Dirty Words, The Life and Crimes of George Carlin. So I'm actually in this documentary, which was a pleasure because you guys did such an amazing job with it. So thank you for doing it. Thank you for having me. And thanks for doing this tonight. You want to just sort of begin with the easy stuff? You want to tell me, how do you know? I mean, so I'll just say that we'll get into it a little bit later, but Mike has done several documentaries about stand-up comics, really good ones. Is that how you met Apatow? How did he bring, I'm assuming it was kind of his baby to do what he wanted with, and he brought you in as co-director. Is that true?
Yes, part of it's true. Judd and I didn't meet that way. We met about 10 years ago. I was directing an episode of a TV show called Iconoclasts for Sundance Channel. and Judd was a subject of it. And so I was directing it. It was Judd and Lena Dunham right at the time, just before Girls came out on HBO. And Judd and I spent time together on that and just kind of hit it off. And we stayed in touch afterward. And then he called me. Well, we talked about doing something together. We weren't quite sure what it was. We talked about a bunch of different ideas. And then he called me one day in around 2013, toward the end of 2013, about doing a project with the Avett brothers. And so I was interested, and we were off to the races. We made a film called May It Last.
Right.
And then in between that, well, because that took us about 2.5 years, we made a 30 for 30 called Doc and Daryl, about Darryl Strawberry and Dwight Gooden. And we've just continuously, worked together, including on some comedy related projects. Judd was the EP on the Jerry Before Seinfeld special that I directed. And he also EP'd Gary Gulman, The Great Depression, which is both of those are stand-up and documentary and some semi-scripted stuff. And and then we did just straight stand-up special with Ricky Velez just last year. So we've been working together for a while. And the way that this project came about, was a producer in the UK named Teddy Leifer with a company called Rise Films, and he had been lobbying Kelly Carlin and Jerry Hamza, who control the Carlin estate, for quite a while to do a documentary. And Kelly was very reluctant to do it. And then eventually Teddy kind of convinced her that it had to get done. And so somehow Judd's name came up. I'm not sure if he was suggested by HBO or by whom. But then once Judd was involved, he called me to do it together. So
I've gotten to know Kelly a little bit over the years. And she, she's great in the film, and I think she probably brought the family aspect to it, right? Like the stuff about her mother. She probably wanted you guys to make sure that her mother got her due, right? And
well, she never said anything about that. We that was really, we felt like telling the full story would always involve the family. We also had George's brother, Patrick, his second wife, Sally Wade. But Kelly, obviously, she's his only kid. It's not a big family at all. It was just George and his brother. His brother has one son, and George had Kelly, and that's it for the Carlins. So, telling the George, Brenda was so integral to his life, to his work through so much of it. They had a marriage from I might be wrong on the date, I think 61. They got married, and she died in 1997. And so she was there along with him. And, it's sort of a rare thing, I think, in show business, especially like in the 60s and 70s and through the 80s, that they stayed together. That's not common. So we knew from the beginning that if we were going to try and paint a full picture of George the man, that we would want to include his family life as well.
Right. Let's talk about let me ask you this. When you and Judd started talking about doing this, what level was your trepidation in terms of like, okay, I've done plenty of documentaries, I know what I'm doing, but this is a guy who's, on the Mount Rushmore of comedy, and comedy is one of your main things. You can't screw it up, basically, right?
It was terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. No, I mean, I had done a year before, and it actually got extended because of the pandemic. But so there wasn't quite overlap, but there was almost overlap between a film I did about Patrice O'Neill, called "Killing Is Easy," and that was extremely daunting because Patrice has such a massively devoted following, but not on the scale of Carlin. I mean, Carlin is, as you said, he's on the Mount Rushmore. And we
just say, sorry to interrupt you, but let's just say, I think there's probably plenty of people who think they're comedy fans who don't even know who Patrice was. That
was part of the reason to make the film. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, he died young, but he was from Boston.
Yep.
I think I probably first saw him on the Colin Quinn show, right?
Yeah.
15 years ago or whatever, which is kind of where a lot of people first saw him, basically. He was fantastic and absolutely took no prisoners. And if anybody gets a chance and is interested in comedy, watch Mike's doc on Patrice. It's great.
Yeah, it's you can get it on Paramount Plus or on iTunes. But yeah, coming out of that, Patrice was somebody who was kind of never got to the level that many people believed he deserved, and George spent decades at that level,
right?
And he also, it's been a while since he passed. He died in 2008, and so we started this film in 2020. And when a lot of time passes, I think the anticipation kind of increases, and it was very clear, especially we had almost 4 hours to tell the story. It's like, you really can't fuck it up. So it's really only been very recently. I mean, the film premiered on May 20th on HBO, and we had only finished it about 3.5 weeks before that. And so it's only been in the past couple of weeks that I've been able to kind of exhale and be like, okay, we did all right. That we've gotten enough feedback that we didn't screw it up, and people are really responding positively.
Can you point to anything in particular in terms of sort of HBO's reaction or Kelly's reaction, or just random hearsay on social media, or from just a fan who reached out to you guys and said something in particular that made you feel like, okay, yeah, right, we did it?
Yeah, I mean, there've been so many, and Judd, knowing everybody in comedy, we've gotten feedback from a lot of really big, important people in comedy, who, and it's just been universally positive, and so, and even just obsessively looking on Twitter, searching for the film to see what people are saying.
You don't do that, do you?
Oh, of course not. No, never. But when I don't do that, I've noticed that there's I can count on one hand the number of negative things, and it's usually about me and Judd putting our politics into the film.
Yeah, of course.
But it's really it's been really extraordinary. We'll
get to that part in a minute. But let me ask you about yourself. Obviously, comedy is one of your specialties. How did that come about? What's your comedy background? What were you listening to? Really? What were
I have no comedy background. No,
really? No, I don't mean you doing comedy. I mean you consuming comedy.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've been a comedy fan my whole life.
Yeah. So what did you grow up on?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, SCTV was huge as a kid, and that was always a touchstone. But really, just about everything. I mean, from watching Three Stooges as a kid to, I'm just a huge consumer of comedy, and so getting to actually work in comedy. Not only doing documentaries about comedy and comedians, but also getting to work with some comics like Jerry Seinfeld and Gary Gulman and Ricky Velez on helping them shape their specials. It's extraordinary. Really, really incredible. And I have no qualifications really. Sorry, I left one out. It's kind of big. David Letterman. I did the first season of Dave's Netflix show.
Yeah,
we didn't have a lot of comedy in that. It's not
right.
Super funny, but it's Dave.
I've heard that he's a comedian though.
He can be funny. Yeah. But I really, I absolutely kind of stumbled into it, and really all credit to Judd, because he connected me with Seinfeld. That was the first comedy credit I had. Nothing prior to that, and I'd been working in documentary film for quite a few years. I never did anything funny. And then all of a sudden I'm working with Jerry on his first special in 15 years, and it was pretty cool.
Right. Let's talk about Gulman for a second, because I know you're friends with him.
The Boston guy.
Yeah. Did you become friends with him through? So let's just say Gary Gulman, The Great Depression, for anybody who's not familiar, again, a Boston, bred comic, of which so many are. But his special, what year did the Great Depression come out? 2017?
2018.
18. Okay.
Wait, is that true? No, 2019. 2019.
Okay. So it's about Gary's obviously bout with hardcore depression and coming out the other side of it. And so it's part documentary about him openly and frankly speaking about it, and partly him doing stand-up comedy addressing that. So there's been like a wave in recent years of documentaries like that one, comedy docs that are, hybrids, or where the stand-up set itself is kind of a commentary on something in the culture. Hannah Gadsby being one, Tig Notaro, things that are about serious issues, but how we deal with them through comedy. And so tell me about working on, again, an amazing piece of work, The Great Depression. And was that how you befriended Gary? Because I know you guys are close now.
It is. That's how we met, through his manager, Brian Stern. Gary had really left comedy to deal with his mental health issues, and he moved back to Boston, or Peabody, Massachusetts.
Moved in with his mom, right?
His childhood bedroom in his mom's house, and had basically believed that he wouldn't be able to do comedy anymore. And through a number of treatments that he talks about in the special, he was able to kind of come back, and he started writing again. And I met Gary, I think, a week after he moved back to New York. He'd been working on some new material that was, some of it was addressing his depression, and some of it was sort of tangentially, and he wasn't naming it, but the content of it was about what he was experiencing. And his manager, Brian Stern, Gary's a big sports fan, and I'd done a couple of 30s. I did the Bo Jackson one, and I mentioned before the Doc and Daryl with Judd.
Yep.
And he'd also seen the Seinfeld special, Jerry Before Seinfeld, on Netflix. And Brian Stern, Gary's manager, his original idea was doing a documentary about Gary and his struggle, and kind of coming back. And Gary and I met, and just kind of immediately hit it off, and started talking, and had a couple of sessions of just talking, and me asking him questions about his life, and he had been working on some new material, and over the course of about a year, he built a new hour that was really almost entirely about his mental health,
right?
And so we created this special, again, all written by Gary, but sort of conceived and shaped by the two of us. And so, I thought that we could do something that had stand-up and documentary stuff, to kind of, that the documentary material would support what was going on stage, that we could show things in that form about his story that he couldn't really do on stage. It just wouldn't make sense. So we were able to see his psychiatrist and his wife and his mother and all, these people who've been integral in his life, as well as just what it was like for him to talk about this stuff for the first time. And so, so we made that special, and Gary and I've been incredibly close ever since.
Right.
So Gary's the best, and I really encourage people to check out the special.
Absolutely, I do too.
It's also super funny. It's super funny. Like,
you would think that it would be miserable because you're talking about serious depression, but it's not at all. It's very funny.
That was one of the things that we talked about right out of the gate. Was we in fact, you mentioned Hannah Gadsby, and her special had just come out about 6 or so months before, and it was kind of the talk of the comedy world.
Yep.
Gary and I are both big admirers of her and that special, but we said, like, this needs to be really funny. It needs to be comedy.
Yeah.
And getting into these very, very serious, deep issues and struggles, but with lots of jokes. And there's nobody funnier than Gary. And so, so that's what we did. Yeah.
Let's go back to Carlin.
Gary gave me this T-shirt I'm wearing that has Paul Lynde on it. So.
Oh, nice. Very nice. Okay. So let's go back to Carlin. You guys covered all the bases. Obviously, you told his entire life story. You went through all the phases, that he clearly had. That's one of my favorite things about writing that book was that he really sort of represented pretty much the entire era of stand-up comedy from the 50s on in his own way. He was either leading with certain styles, like moving into hippiedom, the counterculture, going into observational comedy in the 80s. Or he was looking at what some of the other pioneers were doing, like Sam Kinison, and saying, oh, I could do that too. I could be loud and ranty too. But in one way or the other, he kind of represented 5 decades of stand-up comedy and how it evolved in America, from the time that stand-up comedy really was a thing at all in the 50s. Before that, it was just vaudeville and shtick.
Very much so.
Yeah. So the guy himself was a prism for the all of stand-up comedy. Do you guys feel like how much do you feel you were able to uncover, whether archival stuff or stories from the interviews that you did, or just digging that hadn't already been told? I mean, the guy was obviously a household name and a public face for 50 years. How much do you think you were able to find that was previously unknown or clips that had been unseen?
There was a lot of stuff. I mean, one thing that made George such a perfect subject for a documentary is he was a hoarder, and he obsessively saved everything. His notes, recordings of himself that he'd made since he was a kid. Right. We had home movies and his joke notes and ideas and things like that. And we had access to everything.
Right.
And so there were a number of things that no one has ever seen that are in the film. The personal stuff primarily.
Right.
And then, to have the resources to be able to do the deep dive on finding everything that exists that he was ever on was very exciting. And then there are a couple of pieces of footage in the film that were like clips of him on talk shows and things that only exist in his own personal copy that he had saved. There's one particular clip that it's George and Brenda from, I believe, 1970, where they're on a talk show and they're talking about drugs, and it's terrible quality. I mean, you see in the film, but the reason it's such poor quality is because it was on an early version of a VCR that George taped at home. And so, but that show we couldn't find. I mean, it's gone. And there's a lot of, archival things still, they would tape over famously a number of years of the Johnny Carson Tonight Show.
Unbelievable that the networks did that for years, right? We need the tape. We don't need the old show. We need the tape.
Exactly. And things have been lost in fires or misplaced or whatever. But having George as a subject who saved so many things,
right?
It was very exciting but in terms of stories and things, I'm sure there's plenty of stuff in the film that people are unfamiliar with, that what hasn't been made public before. Yeah, there are certainly a few things, but something like, for example, Tony Orlando telling the story of George coming to him, asking him for a job in 1976. Tony's probably told that story before at cocktail parties or something, but not publicly. And so there are a number of fun details there. And I think even for somebody, I mean, maybe not for you, since you wrote a book on Carlin, but I think for even people who are fans and who, followed his career and thought they knew a lot about him, they're going to discover some new stuff.
Right. So let's talk about the montage at the end. I think you mentioned earlier that, if there are negative comments, it's from people from a certain, political persuasion who claim, are trying to tell you guys that you're inserting your own politics into. I mean, isn't the whole point about, let's just say that the montage part, it's like the last, 15 minutes or so of the film?
Yeah, it's in the last 15 minutes, and it's a 5-minute piece. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's clips of, current events juxtaposed with him talking as if he was, a soothsayer, right? Like he's talking, he's telling us what's going to happen down the road in the future, or commenting on it as though he were still here. He was apolitical, right? So it's pretty much impossible to claim him for one side or the other. But also to make an argument that somehow you guys, cast him as, he's for our team and not the other team, right?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think if anybody has an issue with that, I don't know what to say. I mean, I do think that Judd and I also have our own politics, and there's nothing wrong with putting them into our work, But I think what Carlin, and I think one of the reasons why he's been sort of embraced by all sides of the political spectrum is that the issues he talked about were rarely topical.
Right.
And he very rarely mentioned specific politicians.
On purpose. He said, I don't want my material to be dated 6 months from now. Yeah,
exactly. And it hasn't. And in that particular sequence, to me, it's not only a political statement, but it's also a commentary on the fact that, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, George died in 2008, really just before the internet became what the internet as we know it is. He didn't live to see some of the current debates, but the core ideas are the same. It's the same things that we've been debating forever. And he talks about, in the film, there are clips of him talking about, I think with Carlin, ultimately it comes down to his view that human beings as a species have always made and continue to make poor choices.
Yes.
Emphasizing, in his words, he says, competition over cooperation, property over people.
Right.
If one wants to ascribe those views to a particular political party, okay, but
right.
It was about his values and what his ideas of right and wrong, and how the human race has failed to live up to its potential. And that doesn't age, sadly.
Right. I mean, my favorite thing that he said was, groups want no part of them. One-on-one, I love people.
Right.
Anytime you subscribe to a group, forget about it. I want no part of that. He was independent, to the core. Which is kind of why some people think that they can adopt him and his views as their own. I'm an independent thinker too, right? So
right.
Yeah.
Just like everybody else.
Just like everybody else. Exactly right. The lineup of comedians who you guys brought in to talk about him is absurd. Obviously, it's basically every living great comedian, and then some. I can't imagine anybody said, "Nah, I really don't have anything to say about Carlin." If they're a comedian, if they're a stand-up comic, right? I can't imagine that happened at all. But was there any surprises, or were there any folks who you didn't expect to get that you did get, or were there any surprises that you feel like telling tales out of school about that people who didn't end up in the film?
Yeah, I mean, there were a handful of, just a very small handful of people who really said, who said no, but because they felt like they just didn't know enough about Carlin to really feel comfortable. But I mean, his influence is absolutely undeniable in just about everybody, and really any comic who says they're not influenced by Carlin, when they name their influences, those people were certainly influenced by Carlin. Right. So what we really wanted to do was to show not only the biggest people in comedy, but also a broad spectrum of styles of comedy. Because as you were talking about before, he really spanned so many different styles, and he influenced. In fact, I think on the same day that I interviewed you, I had Stephen Wright there.
Yeah,
who's not a person that I, before making this film, I'm a huge Stephen Wright fan. Never would have thought of him as being massively influenced by Carlin.
He's a huge Carlin fan. Yeah,
huge Carlin.
Yeah,
huge.
Yeah.
And so to have such different styles of comedy represented was exciting to us, and I think it speaks to the depth and breadth of Carlin's influence on comedy as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Not that Boston has any kind of a monopoly on comedy, but
there's a lot of
there's a lot. There has been a lot.
Disproportionate.
Disproportionate is a nice, that's a diplomatic way of putting it. But the guy who probably, I think, the sort of celebrity comedian who nailed him best, I think, might have been Bill Burr.
Fantastic.
And he, in the trailer, he says the thing about how, like, oh, by the time my buddies and I mean, he's so abrasive, so funnily abrasive, but yeah, my buddies and I thought we were going to go laugh at the old fart, basically, right?
Yeah.
And then he was like, "Oh my God, he brought out the howitzer and he crushed me," really good. But beyond that, I mean, what else he had to say about him was like, it's so funny when people say, "Yeah, comedians don't want to talk about comedy because it ruins the joke." I mean, comedians are great at dissecting jokes and figuring out what matters and why things work and why they don't. And Bill Burr, I've interviewed him a couple of times. He's particularly great at it.
He's fantastic at it. And I had met Bill. He was the executive producer of the Patrice O'Neill documentary, and so I knew him through that. And when he came for the Carlin interview, one of the first things he said was, I didn't prepare anything. I didn't do any homework. I didn't look at any old clips. I just want to wing it. And I'm thinking, well, it would have been helpful if you maybe looked at a couple of clips and prepared a little bit. And
knew the stuff, right?
He knew the stuff inside and out.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't need to prepare. It was just there. I mean, and he was calling out very specific things in performances that George did that many of those moments are in the film. He's a brilliant guy. And really just has such an incredible ability to convey his ideas verbally. And also has just an extraordinary memory. I mean, it kind of blew me away. Yeah.
Right. So do you feel like you need to step away from comedy for any reason right now? I mean, before we went on, you were saying that you're kind of, working on what's next and haven't actually nailed the next thing down yet.
Yeah.
You don't feel like, oh, I should give comedy a rest?
No, I mean, because there's so much, comedy is such a broad topic, it's like when people call documentary a genre, and it's like, what are you talking about? It's a form, and so, I've been able to, so far, the work that I've done in comedy, I think it's certainly been different enough. Each project has been different enough from the others to keep me interested, and there's still lots of things I would love to do in comedy, both in terms of, working with stand-up comics as well as documentaries. So, I would love to have more opportunities to work in comedy. Yeah.
Right. Is there a moment in the film that you particularly, I was watching you watch the trailer.
Oh.
Straight faced, and you're like, I've seen it a zillion times. I've edited the crap out of this stuff, is there a moment that you still laugh at, that after having looked at it, hundreds of times in the editing room?
Yeah, I honestly, and this is going to sound terrible, but the only moment that, because I saw it recently, it's a beast. And so you got to, sit through it so many times when we were working on the edit, but the moment that cracked me up at a screening that we did in New York, or no, in LA, I think that was the last time I saw part one. It's the Rick Moranis making fun of him on SCTV. I mean,
right?
It's just so fucking funny.
Right. And whoops to Rick Moranis, because he was like, this guy's so over, and then he had 30 more years or whatever.
Absolutely. But that particular impression really bothered George. And it really got to him. And I think it was because he knew that those were the smartest, funniest people doing comedy at that time. And it was like, oh, the really good ones have got my number.
Well, I wonder if it was also partly that he felt like, I have a number, there's something that I do that's, sort of, irreducible, it's
probably,
he could do we talked about it already. He could do every kind of comedy there is, he could do everything from the silliest slapstick to the most hardcore, dark black comedy and everything in between. And he was probably like, oh crap, they nailed me. Like there's a certain thing about what I do that is, prone to parody. Right. That's probably what bothered me.
I think it probably did. Yeah. And I mean, to me, like I find those parts of his story where when things aren't going so well, that's the most interesting. That's the most inspiring stuff, because we can all relate to that,
Yeah.
Most of us can't relate to massive success, but we can all relate to things not working and trying to find our way through a creative process and figure out our voice and stuff like that. I can relate, and so those parts of his story, I'm especially drawn to, when he's trying to figure it out.
Right. Credit to Stephen Colbert for actually saying what a lot of regular fans say, oh, wow, last few specials or whatever, last 10 years of his life or whatever, got really dark. And I can't tell you how many people I heard say this after I wrote my book, like, oh my God, I love George Carlin, except for the last 10 years or so, he kind of lost me. He got really dark. That's some of my favorite stuff. But
Mine too.
But I mean, you have to have a stomach for that, obviously. And he knew that. And he was like, he was pushing. He was like, I only have a few more years left. Yeah. Plus I'm old, so I can play the cranky old man.
Right. Which I think he relished. I think he really enjoyed being.
But he also saw what was coming, which we're dealing with now, which is that, this whole division stuff and everything. And the planet, is fine. The people are fucked, that kind of stuff. I mean, like, he got dark for a reason, and for multiple reasons, both for personal satisfaction and also because of what he saw around him. And again, I guess you have to have a stomach for it. And if you want just a guy who's joking about being stoned and eating up too many Oreos or whatever, that's great too. But it's not. I get it. But so how did you guys deal with that? And I can't remember if you specifically addressed it. Besides, people like Colbert saying. Yeah, and it's kind of where he lost me.
Yeah. Oh no. I mean, that's very much in the film, and we talked about that of what we have people sort of speculating about what was he doing then. What was he trying to do? Because it's not always funny. Again, in the same show that he would have that darkest stuff, he would also have a bunch of fart jokes and silly stuff. Because that was always what he was. He was all, but no, the film, I think, it really does address the complexity of those last, that sort of final incarnation of George the comedian. And interestingly, his angriest, darkest stuff was happening at a period in his life when, in his personal life, he was incredibly happy. He had found love again in his second wife. He had a great life and he enjoyed it. He was very happy personally. But I think that, one of the things about that material that I just remember, watching it as it was coming out, feeling like, only somebody his age who we've trusted for all these years, we've seen him transform, could really get away with that and have us kind of take it seriously, on
that scale. So like, Bill Hicks did it as a much younger guy, but he was never, obviously died prematurely, but he was never going to be at the level of selling out arenas or whatever.
Right.
Probably because too many folks are squeamish about that darkness, about letting a comedian take you to that dark place. And Carlin, like you said, that's a great point. He had, gained our trust for decades. So, many of his fans were willing to go with him there.
Yeah. I mean, he engendered so much goodwill over the years. And he also, though, I think there was always something about Carlin that, we don't really talk about this in the film, but that you just believed that he was a good guy, which by all accounts he was. But his stage persona also was one that he could be, even when he was saying the worst things, you knew that underneath, this is a good guy. This is Uncle George. Like he's okay. I think
set him with a twinkle in his eye.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that really mattered. You know, we were more willing to take in that darkness from that man, you know.
Right.
And it's some of my favorite of his stuff for sure.
Yeah.
Those last
I'll ask you one more question and we'll wrap up. Thanks for doing this. You know, he was, you know, so I said why I was so thrilled to write that book, because he did represent 50 years of stand-up comedy, but he also was like a modern day philosopher. And I mean, you know, that's kind of a cliche. I mean, people talk about that a lot, about how comedy, it works like modern day philosophy in some ways, but he legitimately was that.
Yeah.
So is there anything in particular that, like, you know, that you've taken away from studying the guy for a couple of years, making this film, that is kind of like a life lesson that you appreciate? Anything in particular? If I'm putting you on the spot, just tell me.
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of like what I was saying before, is that like about him continuing to grow and find his voice as an artist, you know.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
I think anybody in a creative field is always trying to figure out what we're trying to say and how to say it. And it's hard, and it's a struggle. And he was not only a brilliant artist, he was an incredible craftsman.
Exactly.
That 50-year career, through all of those different phases of show business, he was able to use all of those tools and use them to his advantage, even when he was doing material much later, that it's kind of hard to see a connection between the hippy dippy weatherman and the angry, you know, Job yelling at the heavens of his last special. But all those techniques are there. And so he worked very hard, and he never kind of sat back and rested on his laurels. And he always wanted to push and grow, and not for glory, I don't think. You know, obviously at some times he did, but I think ultimately it was he cared about being an art. He wanted to be an artist.
But he did it for himself. He was, he was good at it, and he knew he was good at it, and he wanted to be as good at it as he could be.
There's a moment in the film where he talks about an interview that Pablo Casals, the cello player.
Oh yeah, sure, right.
When he, you know, it's a famous quote, but you know, he was in his 90s, and somebody said, you know, why do you still practice every day for 3 hours? And he said, well, I'm noticing some improvement.
Right.
And that was something that George related to. And I really admire that. It's a great lesson for anybody.
Well, I was just going to say, may we all take a lesson from that. Mike, really appreciate your doing this with us. Thanks so much.
So much fun. Yeah.
Thanks a ton
for being in the film.
Making the film. Yeah. Thanks for making it. You know what?
Helping us out.
My sons watched it, not because I'm in it, but because they're interested. And, you know, for me to get them to watch something that is my recommendation is nearly impossible, but they understand that, you know, Carlin mattered. And, you know,
they like it.
Yeah, they loved it. And, you know, and they give, they're like young men. They're like 18 to 20, early 20s. And, you know, and now they can give me all kinds of crap for, you know, just because they think I'm terrible on camera, but that's
that's really cool to hear, because that was one thing that we always wanted, was to you know, that's one of the things with these films, like, you know, with the Gary Shandling film we did with the Neil, it's like you want a
generation that maybe hasn't heard of them yet, that needs to be introduced. Yeah, exactly right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
yeah. So despite the fact that their father was in it, they really enjoyed it and got something out of it. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, thanks again. We will we'll hopefully see you all next month in the Watch Club. We got a good one coming up. We'll post about that soon. And thanks again, everybody. Happy 4th of July. We'd like to thank our sponsors as always, and we'll see you soon.